Nestled in the Andean Mountains, Mérida is a city brimming with charm. Its cobblestone streets, pastel-colored houses, and the towering Sierra Nevada peaks paint a picture of tranquility. But beneath its postcard-perfect exterior, whispers of strange occurrences have begun to circulate. It was this mix of beauty and mystery that drew 5 friends, Adriana, Luis, Camila, Javier, and Diego, to embark on a road trip from Caracas to Mérida. What started as a simple getaway soon became a journey into the unknown. Adriana, the de facto leader of the group, was a history buff with an insatiable curiosity for local folklore. Her excitement was palpable as they drove up winding mountain roads, the warm Venezuelan sun glinting off their car's windows. "Did you know Mérida is one of the most haunted cities in the country?" she asked, flipping through a travel guide. Luis, the skeptic of the group, scoffed. "Ghosts are for people with overactive imaginations," he said, dismissing her enthusiasm. But Camila, always one for drama, leaned in. "Overactive or not, they say the shadows in Mérida aren't like anywhere else. They move when they shouldn't." Their arrival in the city was met with the typical bustle of a tourist hub. Street vendors lined the Plaza Bolivar, selling arepas and dulces abrilantados, while the faint melody of a harp played from a corner where an elderly man serenaded passersby. Despite the lively atmosphere, Adriana couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. "Is it just me, or does it feel heavy here?" she asked as they unloaded their bags at a quaint inn overlooking the mountains. The innkeeper, a wiry man named Don Efren, overheard her comment and chuckled darkly. "You must be feeling the weight of the ceiba tree," he said cryptically. "This land carries its secrets." Intrigued, Adriana pressed him for more, but Efren quickly grew evasive, muttering something about staying indoors after sunset. Javier joked about it, calling him an old superstitious relic, but Adriana felt a pang of unease. That night, as the group wandered the city, they found themselves drawn to the San Jose market, a bustling hub of food, crafts, and local curiosities. Luis and Diego were eager to try local rum, while Camila marveled at the intricate woven textiles. Yet Adriana's attention was captured by a stall selling faded photographs and letters. "These are the belongings of the vanished," said the vendor, an elderly woman with piercing green eyes. "People who disappeared in the shadows of Mérida." Her words sent a chill down Adriana's spine. She examined a photograph of a young woman, her face blurred as if the camera had caught her mid-motion. "How do people vanish?" Adriana asked. The vendor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The shadows take them," she said, her tone so grave that Adriana almost laughed out of nervousness. But as she looked at the woman's face, she swore she saw the faint outline of another figure in the photograph, a dark silhouette lurking just behind the subject. Later that night, as they regrouped at a cafe to share their day's adventures, Adriana recounted her encounter at the market. Luis dismissed it as a scam to sell cheap trinkets, but Javier seemed intrigued. "It's not just Mérida," he said. "There are stories like this all over Venezuela. Shadows that follow you. Shadows that aren't your own." Diego, ever the joker, waved a flashlight under his face. "Maybe it's El Silban. He's coming to whistle us to death." Camila slapped his arm, though her laughter was tinged with unease. As they walked back to the inn, the streets were eerily quiet, the festive energy of the day replaced by an oppressive stillness. The shadows cast by streetlights seemed unnaturally long, stretching across the cobblestones like dark fingers. Adriana, bringing up the rear, thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement in a shadow that didn't belong to any of them. When she turned, nothing was there. "Are you okay?" Camila asked, noticing Adriana lagging behind. "Yeah," Adriana replied, though her voice betrayed her doubt. The next morning, Adriana woke to find Don Efren standing by the inn's entrance, staring out at the street with a solemn expression. "Did something happen?" she asked. He turned to her, his face pale. "Another one vanished," he said simply, gesturing toward a police car parked a few blocks away. Word spread quickly among the locals. A young man, last seen walking home from work, had disappeared without a trace. Adriana felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The shadows of Merida were beginning to feel all too real. That afternoon, as the group planned their next excursion, Adriana couldn't help but wonder, was the city's beauty merely a mask for something darker? And if the shadows truly did hold secrets, how long would it be before they found themselves ensnared by them? She glanced at her friends, laughing and carefree, and felt a pang of fear. In a city where shadows danced to their own rhythm, who could say where darkness ended and danger began? The morning air in Merida was crisp and vibrant, the sun's rays dancing on the snow-capped peaks that loomed in the distance. Despite the previous night's unsettling events, the group decided to press on with their plans. "We're not going to let local ghost stories ruin our trip," Luis declared over breakfast, slathering butter on a slice of freshly baked bread. Adriana, however, was quieter than usual, her eyes fixed on the window as she absent-mindedly stirred her coffee. The weight of Don Efren's words about the vanished man lingered in her mind. Their destination for the day was the Páramo La Colada, a misty highland known for its breathtaking views and serene ambience. As they drove through narrow mountain roads, the conversation shifted to local legends. Camila, seated in the back with Adriana, eagerly brought up a story she had heard from a coworker. "Have you guys ever heard of El Silban?" she asked, her tone conspiratorial. "Isn't that the ghost that whistles before he kills you?" Javier replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel as they navigated a sharp turn. Camila nodded. "Exactly. They say it's the spirit of a man who killed his father and was cursed to wander the plains forever. If you hear him whistling close, it means he's far away. But if it sounds distant, he's near." Luis rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Camila. You're just repeating the same story everyone in the Llanos tells kids to scare them into behaving." But Camila wasn't deterred. "Say what you want, but people swear they've seen him. Especially here in Merida. They say he sometimes follows hikers or campers in the mountains. And if he likes you, he might just let you live." Adriana, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up. "What if the shadows here are connected to him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Diego laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, let's hope he likes us then, right? Maybe we'll charm him with arepas and coffee." The group arrived at the trailhead and began their hike through the Páramo, the mist swirling around their feet like ghostly tendrils. The air was thin but refreshing, carrying the earthy scent of damp moss and wildflowers. Despite the beauty of their surroundings, an unspoken tension lingered. Adriana kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she had seen movement in the mist. She told herself it was just the wind stirring the tall grasses. As they reached a clearing, they decided to take a break. Luis unpacked sandwiches while Diego played music on his phone. The lively notes of Venezuelan folk music momentarily dispelled the unease. But just as Adriana began to relax, she noticed something peculiar. There was no bird song. The Páramo, usually alive with the chirping of mountain birds, was eerily silent. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others paused, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint and haunting, came the sound of whistling. The notes were slow and deliberate, rising and falling in a melody that sent chills down their spines. "It's probably another hiker," Luis said, though his voice wavered. Adriana shook her head. No one else was on the trail. "We're the only ones here." The whistling grew louder, but the strange thing was how its direction kept shifting. One moment, it seemed to come from the left, the next from behind them. "Let's keep moving," Javier said, his voice tense. The group hurriedly packed up and continued along the trail, but the whistling followed them, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. The mist thickened, obscuring their path. Adriana felt her chest tighten as the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Suddenly, Luis stumbled and let out a sharp cry. He had tripped over something half buried in the ground. As Adriana and Camila helped him up, Javier knelt to inspect the object. It was a weathered leather bag, its contents spilling out, a rusted knife, a faded photograph, and what looked like human bones. "What the hell is this?" Javier muttered, recoiling. Before anyone could answer, the whistling stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their ragged breaths. Then, from the mist ahead, a figure emerged. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. In its hand, it held a sack that sagged heavily, as if filled with something unspeakable. "El Silban," Adriana whispered, her voice trembling. The figure took a step closer, and with it came a cold wind that seemed to sap the strength from their legs. Luis, usually the bravest, turned and bolted, shouting for the others to follow. The group didn't hesitate, their flight punctuated by the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. By the time they reached their car, they were breathless and shaking. The mist had thinned, but the sense of dread lingered. As Javier started the engine, Adriana glanced back toward the trail. The figure was gone, but the whistling returned, faint and mocking, as if to remind them that they had not truly escaped. That night, Adriana lay awake in the inn, replaying the day's events in her mind. The bag, the bones, the figure. What if the legend wasn't just a story? As she stared at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder. Had they merely encountered El Silban, or had they somehow invited him into their lives? Back at the inn in Merida, the atmosphere among the group had shifted entirely. The laughter and camaraderie that had characterized the first leg of their trip were replaced by silence and unease. Adriana spent most of the evening seated by the window of her shared room with Camila, her eyes fixated on the darkened mountains beyond. She couldn't shake the memory of El Silban, the whistling, and the leather bag. "Do you think it's really him?" Camila asked, breaking the silence. She sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through her phone, though her focus was clearly elsewhere. Adriana turned to her friend, her expression solemn. "I don't know, but something about today, it wasn't normal. The way the mist moved, the silence, and that thing we saw," she trailed off, her voice catching in her throat. The group reconvened for dinner in the inn's small dining area, the wooden tables lit by flickering lanterns. Their conversation was subdued, each person unwilling to speak about the events of the hike. Diego attempted to lighten the mood with a joke about the inn's rustic decor, but his effort was met with half-hearted smiles. Even Luis, typically the group's loudest and most skeptical, appeared shaken, pushing his food around his plate without eating. "Maybe we should cut the trip short," Camila suggested, her voice hesitant but firm. Luis immediately protested. "We're not leaving because of some ghost story," he snapped, though the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. Adriana looked up from her soup. "It's not just a story anymore, Luis. We all saw it. We all heard the whistling." Javier, ever the pragmatist, interjected. "Let's just be cautious. We'll avoid remote trails and stick to the town tomorrow. There's no reason to panic." The group reluctantly agreed, though Adriana couldn't help but notice how Luis avoided her gaze, as if her acknowledgement of the truth had made it more real for him. That night, Adriana's sleep was restless and fragmented. She dreamt of the mist-covered trail, the figure emerging with its wide-brimmed hat and ominous sack. In her dream, the figure stood still, its presence overwhelming, as the whistle pierced the air like a blade. When she awoke, her heart was pounding, and the faintest echo of the whistle seemed to linger in her ears. Morning brought no solace. As they gathered for breakfast, the group noticed peculiarities in the inn's surroundings. A bird lay dead on the cobblestone path outside, its wings splayed unnaturally. The innkeeper, a wiry man with sun-weathered skin, seemed distracted, muttering prayers under his breath as he served coffee. When Adriana asked him if something was wrong, he simply shook his head and crossed himself. Despite Javier's insistence on staying in town, Luis suggested they visit an old church on the outskirts of Merida, known for its connection to local folklore. "It's a public place," he argued. "There'll be plenty of people around." Reluctantly, the group agreed, hoping the change of scenery might dispel the lingering unease. The church was an imposing structure, its weathered stone walls and towering bell tower standing defiantly against the backdrop of the mountains. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of incense. Candles flickered along the altar, their flames casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Adriana felt a sense of comfort in the sacred space, though it was tinged with an undercurrent of dread she couldn't quite explain. As they explored the church, they noticed a small side room marked with a sign that read "No entrar. Confessionario in reparación. Do not enter. Confessional under repair." Naturally, this piqued Luis's curiosity. "It's probably just storage," he said, grinning as he pushed the door open despite Camila's protests. The room was dimly lit, filled with dust and the faint scent of decay. Adriana followed reluctantly, her breath hitching as she noticed the odd arrangement of objects inside. There were old rosaries, crumbling statues of saints, and an open book lying on a small table in the center. Its pages were covered in scrawled writing that looked more like scratches than text. As Adriana leaned in to examine it, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. "Do you feel that?" Camila whispered, hugging her arms as a shiver ran through her. Before anyone could respond, the faint sound of whistling drifted into the room. It was the same haunting melody they had heard on the trail, and it seemed to be coming from within the walls of the church. Panic set in as the group exchanged terrified glances. Luis backed away from the table, muttering curses under his breath. Adriana felt her legs tremble as the whistling grew louder, surrounding them like an unseen presence. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes that resembled skeletal hands reaching toward them. "Get out!" Adriana shouted, grabbing Camila's arm and pulling her toward the door. The group bolted from the room, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty church. When they reached the main hall, they found the innkeeper waiting for them, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said, his voice low and firm. "That room is cursed. It's where they tried to banish him. The one who whistles." The group stared at him, their fear now mixed with confusion. "What do you mean?" Javier asked. The innkeeper shook his head. "El Silban. He's not just a ghost. He's something much older, much worse. And now he's marked you." Adriana felt her blood run cold at his words. The whistling, the figure, the shadows, it wasn't over. Whatever had been following them wasn't done. And as the group left the church, the weight of the innkeeper's warning settled over them like a dark cloud, a harbinger of the horrors yet to come. The air in Merida seemed thicker the next day, as if the mountain mist had descended into the town itself. Adriana could feel it pressing against her skin as the group walked to the central plaza. The conversation with the innkeeper lingered in her mind. Marked. The word hung there, a sinister declaration she couldn't shake. She avoided voicing her fears, but the tension was palpable in every step they took. Despite their resolve to stick to safer, busier areas, the group couldn't help but feel the strange energy that seemed to permeate even the most ordinary parts of the town. The street vendors' calls sounded distant, warped, as if muffled by some unseen force. The bright colors of the market stalls seemed dulled, like a painting left out in the rain. Adriana noticed how the townspeople avoided eye contact, their faces carrying a shared weariness that hinted at unspoken knowledge. As they moved through the plaza, a young boy approached them, his small hands clutching a bundle of woven bracelets. "For protection," he said simply, his dark eyes locking onto Adriana's. She hesitated before taking one and handing him a few bolivars. The boy didn't thank her or even smile. He simply turned and disappeared into the crowd. Adriana tied the bracelet around her wrist, the rough texture of the thread oddly reassuring. Luis, however, remained his usual defiant self, scoffing at the encounter. "It's all superstition," he said, shaking his head. "Bracelets, whispers, curses. It's just a way to scare tourists into spending money." Adriana didn't respond. She had long since stopped trying to argue with him. Later that afternoon, they decided to visit a small museum dedicated to local legends and folklore, hoping to distract themselves and learn more about the stories they'd stumbled into. The museum was housed in an old colonial building, its walls adorned with faded photographs and artifacts. The exhibits were quiet and unassuming, a stark contrast to the unease Adriana felt in her chest. One exhibit, in particular, caught her attention. It was a glass case containing a small, weathered leather bag. Beneath it was a plaque that read, El Silban. El Portador de las Almas Perdidas, the Whistler, the bearer of lost souls. The bag looked identical to the one they had seen on the mountain trail, and Adriana's breath hitched as she leaned closer to read the description. The text described El Silban as a cursed soul, forever doomed to carry the bones of his family in the bag as punishment for his sins. His presence was said to be marked by his eerie whistling, a sound that grew quieter as he approached, lulling his victims into a false sense of security. The final line sent a shiver down Adriana's spine. To hear his whistle is to be chosen. As she stepped back, she noticed Camila standing beside her, staring intently at the bag. "Do you think this is what we saw?" Camila whispered. Adriana nodded. "It has to be. But why us? Why now?" Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash from the next room, followed by Luis's voice shouting, "It wasn't me." The group rushed in to find a display case shattered on the floor. The object inside, a jagged piece of wood said to belong to the tree where El Silban was hanged, lay ominously on the ground. The museum curator appeared almost immediately, his face pale and his hands trembling. "This is bad," he muttered, crouching to pick up the splintered glass. "Very bad. You shouldn't have come here." "Wait, we didn't do anything," Luis protested, his voice defensive. The curator ignored him, standing up and looking directly at Adriana. "You've brought something with you," he said, his tone heavy with foreboding. "Something that doesn't belong here. The mountain spirits don't take kindly to trespassers." Adriana felt her heart race as the curator handed her a small slip of paper. "Go to this address," he said. "There's someone who can help you. But you need to go before nightfall." As they left the museum, the air seemed to grow colder, the daylight dimming unnaturally. Adriana clutched the paper tightly, her fingers trembling. They had come to Venezuela for an adventure, but now it felt as though they were being pulled into something far darker, something they couldn't fully understand. The address led them to the outskirts of town, where an old woman lived in a small, crumbling house surrounded by overgrown weeds. She greeted them at the door as if she had been expecting them, her eyes sharp and piercing despite her frail appearance. "You've seen him," she said matter-of-factly, not waiting for an answer. Inside, the house smelled of herbs and smoke, the walls lined with shelves of jars containing mysterious substances. The woman gestured for them to sit and began preparing a mixture in a small wooden bowl. "You have crossed into his path," she said, grinding the contents with a pestle. "The whistle is his mark, and now he will follow you until his hunger is satisfied." Luis rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but the rest of the group listened intently, their fear mounting with every word. "Is there a way to stop him?" Adriana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman paused, looking at her with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Perhaps," she said, "but the price will be high. He is not just a spirit. He is a force, a curse born of blood and betrayal. And he does not forgive." As the sun began to set, the woman handed Adriana a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Keep this with you," she said. "It may not save you, but it will slow him down. For now." Adriana took the bundle, her hands shaking. Outside, the first haunting notes of a whistle drifted on the wind, chilling them to the bone. The journey back to the inn was suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot. Each member of the group processed the old woman's words in their own way. Luis still muttered dismissively. Camila clung to Adriana's side, and Diego remained unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if willing the encroaching darkness to retreat. Adriana kept the bundle given to her by the old woman clutched tightly in her arms, its weight far heavier than the herbs and charms it contained. The streets of Mérida seemed different now, as if the shadows cast by the fading light had gained a life of their own. Vendors closed their stalls hastily, barely sparing a glance at the group. It was as though the entire town had entered a pact of silence, retreating indoors to avoid what lurked beyond. Adriana's heart raced with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that the whistle was closer now, though she heard nothing. When they reached the inn, the door was locked. The innkeeper, who had been so warm and accommodating before, cracked the door open just enough to glare at them. "You've been marked," he said bluntly. His face was pale, his eyes full of something that resembled both fear and pity. "You cannot stay here. Leave." "But we didn't do anything," Luis shouted, his voice rising in anger. The innkeeper ignored him and closed the door. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed in the stillness of the street. Adriana wanted to scream, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. They were truly alone now. Desperation drove them to seek shelter elsewhere. But every inn, every guest house, and every home they approached turned them away. The whispers were spreading faster than they could run. The town seemed to conspire against them, its labyrinthine streets leading them in circles until they found themselves back in the central plaza. Night had fallen, and with it came the sound they had dreaded most. A low, haunting whistle pierced the air, its melody slow and deliberate. The sound was deceptively distant, yet it seemed to surround them, creeping into every corner of their minds. Adriana froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whistle grew quieter, fading with each note, and her terror deepened. "He's close." Luis grabbed her arm, his bravado finally giving way to panic. "We have to go now," he hissed, pulling her toward the nearest alley. The group ran blindly, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as the whistle seemed to toy with them, shifting directions, growing louder, then softer. The fog rolled in thick and fast, reducing their world to a few feet of visibility. The first scream came from Camila, who tripped over something in the mist. Diego helped her up, his hands trembling as he pointed to the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was a bag identical to the one they had seen on the mountain trail. And in the museum, Adriana's stomach churned as she noticed the faint imprint of bones pressing against the leather. Before anyone could react, the whistle ceased entirely. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was an oppressive void pressing down on them like a physical weight. Luis opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. His eyes widened in terror as he pointed behind Adriana. She turned slowly, her body refusing to move any faster. There, standing at the edge of the alley, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, its silhouette distorted by the fog. Adriana couldn't make out its face, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was bending in its presence. The figure didn't move, but the whistle returned, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. Adriana clutched the bundle the old woman had given her, her fingers fumbling to unwrap it. Inside was a collection of dried herbs, a small candle, and a piece of chalk. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the woman's instructions. "Draw the circle," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "Adriana, what are you doing?" Diego asked, his voice barely audible over the whistle. "We need to run." "No," she said, her resolve hardening. "We can't run from this." She dropped to her knees and began drawing a circle on the ground with the chalk, her movements frantic. The others watched, torn between disbelief and fear, as she placed the herbs in the center and lit the candle with trembling hands. As the flame flickered to life, the whistle stopped again. The figure seemed to hesitate, its form flickering like a broken projection. Adriana whispered a prayer, her voice steadying as she repeated the words the old woman had taught her. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, but the figure didn't advance. Just when she thought the ritual might be working, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The figure stepped forward, and Adriana realized with horror that the circle wasn't enough. Whatever she had done had only bought them time, not safety. "Run!" she screamed, abandoning the ritual and grabbing Camila's hand. The group bolted, the growl following them, growing louder with each step. The streets twisted and turned, disorienting them further, until they found themselves back at the plaza once more. There, in the center, stood another bag. This one was open, its contents spilling out in a grotesque display of bones and tattered cloth. Adriana's knees buckled as she realized they were caught in a trap, the very fabric of the town conspiring to keep them in its grip. The figure loomed closer, its whistle now a deafening roar in her ears. The air in Merida seemed to grow heavier as the group huddled in the central plaza, gasping for breath. The towering figure had vanished into the fog, but its presence lingered in the oppressive silence that followed. Adriana clutched Camila's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Luis paced frantically, muttering half-formed curses, while Diego scanned the plaza, his face pale and drawn. The open bag of bones at their feet felt like a sinister offering, an invitation they dared not accept. The fog crept closer, thickening in tendrils that coiled around their ankles. It wasn't just mist, it moved with intent, pressing them inward as if guiding them toward something. The buildings surrounding the plaza, once welcoming in their colonial charm, now seemed warped and alien. Their windows, once inviting, stared down like hollow, unblinking eyes. Adriana swore she saw faint movement within, shadows flitting just out of sight. "We need to leave this plaza," Diego said finally, his voice strained but determined. "It's like it's trying to trap us here." "And go where?" Luis snapped, gesturing wildly at the fog. "The whole town is a damn maze. You saw what happened when we ran. We ended up right back here. There has to be a way," Adriana interjected, her voice steadier than she felt. She glanced at the open bag of bones, the image seared into her mind. "This isn't random. It's ritualistic. That bag, the whistle, the fog, it's all part of something bigger." Diego knelt by the bag, careful not to touch it. His brow furrowed as he studied the contents. Weathered bones, scraps of fabric that might have once been clothing, and a symbol etched into a piece of metal, an intricate design of intersecting lines and spirals. "This symbol," he said, showing it to Adriana. "I saw it before. In the museum." Her breath caught. She remembered it too, carved into the base of one of the artifacts they'd examined. The curator had mentioned it briefly, calling it the Marca del Susurro, the Mark of the Whisper. It was said to belong to a forgotten deity, a guardian of boundaries between worlds. The memory sent a shiver down her spine. If the stories were true, they weren't dealing with a ghost or spirit, but something far older and more powerful. Before they could discuss further, the whistle returned. This time it was different, higher-pitched, more erratic, as though it was calling something to them. The fog thickened, curling into shapes that seemed almost human. Adriana's heart raced as she realized the figures weren't solid. They flickered like shadows, their forms incomplete, faces blurred as if erased from memory. One by one, they began to surround the plaza. "Stay close," Adriana whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising whistle. She tightened her grip on the bundle the old woman had given her. If the ritual she'd attempted before wasn't enough, perhaps there was another way to use it. The problem was she didn't know what. The figures didn't move closer, but seemed to pulse with the whistle's rhythm. Luis, unable to bear the tension, broke away from the group. "I can't take this anymore. This is all in our heads, fog, shadows, stupid legends. It's not real." He grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it at one of the figures. The rock passed through harmlessly, but the shadow recoiled as though injured. The whistle faltered, then deepened into a guttural tone. Adriana's stomach dropped. "Luis, don't." Before she could finish, the shadow nearest Luis lunged. It moved faster than her eyes could follow, its form twisting unnaturally as it collided with him. Luis screamed, but it was cut short as the shadow seemed to seep into his body, leaving him convulsing on the ground. The air grew colder, and the whistle resumed, louder and more frenzied than before. Camila screamed and buried her face in Adriana's shoulder. Diego knelt by Luis, his hands trembling as he tried to pull him upright. "He's still breathing," Diego stammered. "But he's burning up." Luis's eyes snapped open, his pupils unnaturally dilated. He sat up slowly, his movements stiff and robotic. "It's watching," he muttered, his voice a strange, hollow echo of itself. "It sees you. It knows." Then, without warning, he bolted into the fog, disappearing before anyone could stop him. "Luis!" Camila cried, but Adriana held her back. "No, we can't follow him. It's what it wants." Diego stood, his expression grim. "We can't stay here either. This plaza, this town, it's alive. It's toying with us. If we don't figure out what this thing wants, we're not going to make it." Adriana nodded, her mind racing. The symbol from the bag, the Marca del Sussurro, held the key. She was sure of it, but unraveling its meaning would require returning to the source, the museum. As much as the thought terrified her, it was their only hope. With no other options, the group set off through the fog once more, the whistle following them like a predator stalking its prey. Adriana could only hope that whatever awaited them in the museum would bring answers, before the shadows claimed them all. The journey to the museum felt impossibly long, even though the streets were eerily devoid of the obstacles they'd faced earlier. The fog seemed to part just enough to guide them forward, as if it wanted them to reach their destination. Adriana couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Every creak of a shutter or rustle of leaves sent her nerves spiraling, but she didn't dare voice her fears. Beside her, Camila clung to her arm, her wide eyes scanning the shadows. Diego walked ahead, his posture tense and his flashlight trembling in his hand. When they reached the museum, the old building loomed like a monolith in the fog, its once grand facade cracked and worn by time. The heavy wooden doors, which had been bolted shut during their last visit, now hung slightly ajar. Adriana hesitated, the sight filling her with unease. The open door felt like an invitation, and after everything they had experienced, she was certain it was a trap. Diego didn't wait. "We don't have time to stand around," he said, pushing the door open with a groan of old hinges. The interior of the museum was steeped in darkness, the air stale and cold. Adriana hesitated, gripping the bundle the old woman had given her like a talisman. She and Camila followed Diego inside, the door creaking shut behind them as though sealing their fate. The exhibits were unchanged, though the dim lighting and pervasive silence gave them an ominous air. The ancient artifacts, shrouded in glass cases, seemed to radiate a strange energy. Adriana's eyes locked onto the centerpiece of the main room, a large stone tablet etched with the Marca del Sussurro. The swirling lines and intersecting spirals seemed almost alive in the flickering light of Diego's flashlight. "This is it," Adriana said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt by the tablet, her fingers tracing the air just above its surface. The symbol, it's connected to the bones in the bag, to whatever's happening here. "What does it mean?" Camila asked, her voice quivering. "Is it a warning? A spell?" Adriana shook her head, frustrated. "I don't know." The curator mentioned it briefly, but he didn't explain much. Something about a boundary, between life and death, or maybe between worlds. Diego pointed his flashlight at an inscription beneath the tablet, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the faded text. "It's in Spanish," he said slowly. "The Guardian sees those who trespass. Only the voice of the offering may silence the watchful one." "The voice of the offering?" Camila repeated. "What does that even mean?" Adriana's thoughts raced. The bones in the bag, the whistle, the shadows, it was all tied together, but the pieces didn't yet fit. "The offering has to be the bones," she said, more to herself than to the others. "But the voice," she stopped, a memory surfacing. The old woman's words came back to her. "The sound carries power. Use it wisely." Her hand went to the bundle, pulling it open to reveal the whistle. Its crude construction felt deceptively ordinary, but she now understood its purpose. "This whistle," she said, holding it up, "it's the voice. It's what the Guardian, or whatever that thing is, wants to hear." Before they could discuss further, a loud crash echoed through the museum. The sound came from the far end of the room, where a display case had toppled over. The fog was seeping into the building through cracks in the walls, moving with unnatural purpose. Adriana's heart pounded as the shadows began to take shape once again, their flickering forms advancing toward the group. "Adriana, do something!" Camila cried, her voice breaking. Adriana raised the whistle to her lips, her hands trembling. She hesitated, unsure if the sound would help or doom them further. "It's the only chance we've got," Diego urged, stepping protectively in front of Camila. Taking a deep breath, Adriana blew into the whistle. The sound was unlike anything she expected, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the air, cutting through the fog like a blade. The shadows froze, their forms wavering as though caught in an invisible wind. The whistle's note grew louder, deeper, as if the instrument had taken on a life of its own. Then, the fog began to pull back, retreating toward the tablet at the room's center. The shadows followed, dragged unwillingly toward the stone as if compelled by an unseen force. The tablet glowed faintly, the spirals of the Marca del Sussurro pulsating with light. Adriana kept blowing, the sound pushing the fog and shadows back until they disappeared into the stone, leaving the room eerily still. Adriana lowered the whistle, her chest heaving. The group stared at the now dormant tablet, its glow fading. Did it work? Camila asked hesitantly. For now, Adriana replied, her voice hoarse. But this isn't over. Whatever that thing is, it's not gone. It's just waiting. Diego nodded grimly. Then we need to figure out what it's waiting for, and how to stop it before it comes back. As they exited the museum, the fog outside had lifted slightly, revealing the ghostly outlines of the town. But the silence remained, heavier than ever, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Adriana clutched the whistle tightly, knowing the respite was temporary. Their journey into the darkness had only just begun. The journey back to Adriana's family home was quieter than the group expected. The dense fog had lifted, and the streets of the town were unnervingly still, as if the chaos that had surrounded them hours earlier had been sucked into the stone tablet along with the shadows. Yet, Adriana felt no relief. The weight of what they'd just experienced and the uncertainty of what lay ahead settled over them like a heavy cloak. Camila walked close to her, silent but wide-eyed, and Diego trailed behind, his flashlight now off, his fingers tightening and relaxing around it in a nervous rhythm. When they reached Adriana's home, the house felt different. Its usual warmth had been replaced with a strange chill, as though the lingering presence of the shadows had tainted even the air. Adriana hesitated on the threshold before pushing the door open. Her mother's rosary beads, hanging by the doorframe, swayed lightly as though stirred by an invisible hand. It was a small movement, but it made her stomach drop. "Do you think it followed us here?" Camila whispered as they stepped inside. "It didn't follow us," Adriana said with more confidence than she felt. "But it's like the whole town is infected. It's everywhere, in the walls, in the air. We're not safe anywhere. Not really." The group gathered in the living room, Adriana carefully laying out the whistle and the bundle of bones on the coffee table. The sight of them made her uneasy. The small fragments of bone, some cracked and weathered, looked impossibly fragile. She thought of the old woman's words again. They hold the story. But what story? She tried to piece it together, but every answer seemed to lead to more questions. "We need help," Diego said, breaking the silence. "There's only so much we can figure out on our own. Someone has to know more about this. Maybe the priest? Or someone from the museum archives?" "No," Adriana said sharply, surprising even herself. "This isn't something we can just explain to someone. Do you think anyone would believe us? A priest would just tell us to pray, and the museum staff would probably laugh us out of the room. Then what do we do?" Camila asked, her voice breaking. "We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to come back." Adriana stared at the bones, her mind racing. There was a growing clarity in her thoughts, as though the pieces were starting to align. "The tablet," she said finally. "It's not just a symbol. It's a gate. Whatever's happening here, it's tied to that tablet and to these bones. If we can figure out who these belong to, we might understand what the shadows want." Diego crossed his arms, skeptical. "And how do you plan to figure that out? It's not like bones come with a name tag." Adriana didn't answer right away. She reached for the whistle, holding it up to the light. The old woman called this the voice of the offering. What if it's more than that? What if it can communicate? Communicate? Camila's voice trembled. "You're saying you want to talk to those shadows?" "Not to the shadows," Adriana clarified. "To the bones. To whatever spirit or memory is trapped in them. They're the key to all of this. If I can figure out how to use the whistle to reach them—" "You don't know what you're messing with," Diego interrupted. "You saw what happened back there. That thing isn't just some memory or spirit. It's a predator." Adriana met his gaze, unflinching. "I know the risks, Diego, but if we don't do something, we're just waiting for it to come for us again. We have to take the fight to it." The room fell into silence, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Diego sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we do it together. No more running off alone. No more secrets." Camila nodded hesitantly. "Together," she echoed, though her voice wavered. Adriana felt a flicker of gratitude, but pushed it aside. There was no room for sentiment now. The town's silence weighed heavily on her, as though the very walls were listening, waiting for her next move. She clutched the whistle tightly, its weight far greater than its size suggested. If this truly was the voice of the offering, then it was time to use it and see what answers it would summon. Adriana spent the evening preparing for what she had come to think of as a ritual, though she had no guide or reference for how to perform it. She sat on the floor of her mother's old sewing room, where the thick walls muffled the occasional creaks and groans of the house. Diego and Camila lingered nearby, watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. The whistle lay in front of her, alongside the bundle of bones and a circle of candles she had hastily arranged. The dim flicker of their light cast shifting shadows on the walls, and Adriana tried not to look too closely at them. "I don't think this is a good idea," Camila said for the third time, her voice small and strained. She hadn't stopped fidgeting since they entered the room, her fingers tugging at the hem of her sweater. "What if we make it worse? What if we summon something?" Diego leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "She's right. We don't even know what this whistle is really for. What if blowing it attracts the thing instead of helping us?" Adriana took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've already thought about that." But the whistle came from the old woman, and she called it the voice of the offering. "Whatever this is, it's part of the puzzle. We can't just ignore it." The room fell quiet as Adriana picked up the whistle. It felt cool against her palm, its carved surface smooth and worn from time. She glanced at the bones, then back at her companions. "Stay with me. If something happens, I need you both here." Diego gave a reluctant nod, stepping closer, while Camila sank into the corner, her eyes wide and fixed on the whistle. Adriana raised it to her lips, hesitating for just a moment before blowing a soft, low note. The sound was haunting, a mournful wail that seemed to fill the air, vibrating in her chest and echoing in her ears long after the note faded. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, the shadows cast by the candles dancing as they had before. But then the air shifted. It grew heavier, pressing against their skin, and a faint sound began to emerge, a whisper, soft and indistinct, as though carried on a breeze. Adriana stiffened, her eyes darting to the circle of bones. The sound was coming from them. "What the hell is that?" Diego whispered, his voice tight with alarm. Adriana held up a hand to silence him, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, still unintelligible but undeniably real. She leaned closer to the bones, her breath shallow. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The whispers shifted, merging into a single voice, hoarse, ancient, and filled with a sorrow that sent chills down her spine. "Who calls the voice of the offering?" it rasped. Adriana swallowed hard, glancing at Diego and Camila, who were frozen in place. I need answers," she said, forcing the words out. "About the shadows, about the tablet, about what's happening to this town." The voice fell silent, and for a moment Adriana feared it had gone. But then it returned, louder and more distinct, as though the spirit behind it had drawn closer. "The gate has been broken," it said. "The balance has been lost. The offering was stolen." "The offering?" Adriana echoed, her mind racing. "Do you mean these bones?" "No," the voice replied, carrying an edge of warning. "The offering is what holds the shadows at bay. The bones are but a remnant of those who failed to protect it." Adriana's chest tightened, the weight of the revelation settling over her. "How do we restore the offering? How do we fix the gate?" The voice hissed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The gate demands blood. It always has. To mend what is broken, you must return what was taken, or give in its place." Camila let out a sharp gasp, her face pale. "What does that mean?" Is it asking for a sacrifice? Before Adriana could respond, the candles flickered violently, and the whispering ceased. The air in the room grew cold, and the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen, taking on unnatural shapes. Adriana clutched the whistle tightly, her mind racing as she tried to process the cryptic message. The room plunged into silence once more, broken only by Diego's voice, low and grim. "It's not just a puzzle," he said, his eyes locked on Adriana. "This thing, it's a test, and if we fail, we might not be the only ones who pay the price." The words that had escaped from the whispering bones still hung in the air, as heavy as the suffocating silence that followed. Adriana sat motionless, staring at the pile of bones and the extinguished candles. The voice had spoken of blood, of an offering that had been stolen, of a balance that had been broken. The implications were terrifying, but what terrified her most was that she could feel the truth in those words. The shadows weren't random, nor were they just a product of her fear. They were tied to something ancient, something older than the town itself. And now that it had awakened, it would not rest until its hunger was satisfied. "We need to talk," Diego said, breaking the tense silence. His voice was uncharacteristically firm, laced with an urgency that struck Adriana like a slap. She turned to face him, noting the dark circles under his eyes. His normally confident posture now slumped. He was afraid, and for good reason. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diego glanced at Camila, who had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, her wide eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that Adriana felt in her own chest. "About the price. Whatever it is that we need to do to stop this, it won't come without consequences. We need to be prepared for what we're dealing with." Adriana took a deep breath. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But we have no choice. The shadows won't stop. I can feel them getting closer, even now." Camila's voice trembled, breaking the fragile calm. "And the blood? What if we have to?" She couldn't finish the sentence. The horror of what she was suggesting was too much for her to put into words. Adriana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the whistle lying on the table. The stillness in the room had deepened, but now it seemed as if the house itself was holding its breath. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. What had been taken? What was the offering? And why had the shadows been drawn to this town? "We can't just walk into this blindly," Diego continued, his eyes fixed on her. "Whatever we need to do, it's not just about solving some riddle. There's a cost." You heard the voice. It said the balance had been lost, that the offering was stolen. Adriana nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. The problem was she didn't have enough information to make a clear decision. Every answer they received seemed to raise more questions. She needed to understand more about the town's history, the tablet, the offering, and most importantly, the nature of the shadows that haunted them. "We need to find out more," she said, her voice resolute. "About the offering. About what happened here all those years ago. If the gate was broken, we have to figure out who broke it and why." Diego nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. "And then what? We just give them what they want? Whatever this offering is?" Adriana stood, her mind made up. "I don't know what the offering is, Diego, but I know we have to find it before it's too late." Her resolve was stronger than ever, but the uncertainty of her own words made her wonder if she was truly prepared for the road ahead. The shadows outside their door were growing, an ever-present threat that seemed to seep into the very fabric of their lives. But what was the true nature of the entity that had cursed this place? The town, its history, and the mysterious tablet. It all seemed to lead to something greater than they could comprehend. And yet, they had no choice but to push forward. "Where do we even begin?" Camila asked, her voice barely audible. Adriana looked at the walls of the old house, at the photographs of ancestors staring back at her. There was a deep connection between the past and the present in this place, a history that the shadows seemed to feed on. The truth was hidden somewhere in these walls, buried beneath years of silence and denial. But the house had never seemed so alive, so full of secrets, until now. "I think," Adriana said slowly, "we need to talk to my mother. She might know something." She always said there was a story in this town that no one dared to speak of. Maybe it's time we learned what it is. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but enough to keep moving forward. There was something her mother had always hinted at, something she had never fully explained. Adriana knew it was time to confront that mystery head-on. Diego's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'll go with you," he said. "We'll figure this out together." Adriana nodded. "We'll need to be careful. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not just some story. It's real, and it's coming for us." As they prepared to leave the room, the temperature seemed to drop again, and Adriana felt a shiver run down her spine. There was no turning back now. The shadows were drawing closer, and every moment spent in ignorance was a moment that brought them one step closer to their doom. The search for answers was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a race against time. Her footsteps were heavy as she moved toward the door. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The whispers from the bones echoed in her mind, reminding her of the price they had yet to pay. Would they find what they were looking for? Or would they, too, become part of the offering? Only time would tell. As Adriana and Diego stepped into the cool, night air, the house behind them seemed to exhale with a deep, unsettling groan, as if it was alive and aware of their departure. Camila stayed behind, too frightened to join them on their search for answers. Adriana could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her as she walked down the familiar path that led to her mother's house. It had always been a place of safety, of warmth, until now. The walls of the house, once welcoming and full of life, now felt like they were closing in, hiding secrets that had long been buried. The town of Takaira was eerily quiet, its streets illuminated by flickering streetlights that cast long shadows. Even the wind had stilled, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Adriana glanced at Diego, who walked beside her, his eyes scanning the empty streets. He, too, could feel the strange stillness in the air, and he knew that time was running out. "What do you think your mother knows?" Diego asked, breaking the silence. Adriana hesitated. "I don't know, but she's always hinted at something about the town's history. I think she's been hiding it from me, from everyone. Maybe she doesn't even realize how much she knows." Diego nodded. "That's what I'm worried about. We're looking for something that might not be meant to be found." Adriana's mind raced as they made their way toward the small house on the outskirts of town. Her mother had always been secretive, especially about the past. There had been rumors, whispers of strange occurrences in Takaira. Disappearances, strange happenings, unexplained deaths. But her mother had always dismissed them, claiming they were just old superstitions. Still, Adriana had always wondered if there was more to those stories than her mother let on. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and silent. Adriana's heart quickened as they reached the front door, and for the first time in her life, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. What if her mother knew more than she was letting on? What if she had been hiding something all these years, something that could explain the strange occurrences that had started to plague them? She knocked softly, the sound echoing in the empty street. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing her mother's tired face. "Adriana," she said, her voice soft but filled with an unmistakable edge. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "I need to talk to you," Adriana said, stepping inside. Diego followed her in, closing the door behind them. Her mother didn't say anything at first, but Adriana could see the wariness in her eyes. She had seen that look before, whenever Adriana had asked too many questions about the past. She motioned for them to sit, and the three of them gathered around the small kitchen table. "About what?" "Adriana," her mother asked, her tone guarded. Adriana took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "About the town, about the tablet, and the shadows." Her mother's face changed, her expression faltering for just a moment. Adriana noticed it, but she didn't comment. This was it, the moment she had been both anticipating and fearing for years. "Listen to me," her mother said slowly, her voice low. "There are things in this town that shouldn't be remembered, things that are best left in the past." Adriana's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happened here?" Her mother's gaze shifted to Diego, then back to Adriana. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Of the people who disappeared? The strange occurrences? It's all tied to the same thing. The offering, the gate that was broken, and the price that has yet to be paid. Adriana leaned forward, urgency flooding her veins. What happened to the offering, Mom? Why was it taken? Her mother's eyes softened with a sadness that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. It was stolen long ago by those who thought they could control it. But you can't control something like that. It was never meant to be controlled. Who stole it? Diego asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Her mother hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall before answering. It wasn't just one person. It was a group, an ancient order of sorts. They believed they could harness the power of the offering, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The gate was shattered, and the shadows were released. The balance was lost. Adriana's mind raced. And the shadows? They're linked to the gate. Her mother nodded, her expression grim. Yes, the shadows are not just some manifestation of fear. They're the result of the broken gate. They feed off the town's history, its regrets, its lost souls. And now they've returned to claim what was taken. Diego leaned back in his chair, processing the information. So the gate can be fixed? We can restore the balance? Her mother shook her head, her face pale. I don't know. No one does. But the offering, if it's returned, it might be possible to close the gate again. But that would mean facing the consequences. Whatever is bound to the offering has a price, and it's one that no one has been willing to pay. Adriana's throat tightened. But the shadows are coming for us, for everyone. We don't have a choice. Her mother's gaze softened. I've known that too. That's why I've kept you away from it, try to protect you. But the truth is, it's bigger than any of us. The offering may hold the key to saving this town, or condemning it. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest. The pieces were falling into place, but they were far from complete. The shadows were linked to the broken gate, and the only way to stop them was to restore what had been lost. But the offering was more than just an object. It was a curse, a dangerous force that demanded a sacrifice. The air in the room grew heavy, and Adriana realized that her mother was right. There was no easy way out of this. The cost of knowledge had already begun to take its toll, and the truth was more terrifying than she had ever imagined. But it was the only way forward, and they had no choice but to face whatever came next. Adriana couldn't sleep. The conversation with her mother echoed in her mind, the weight of their shared history pressing down on her like an unseen hand. She stared out the small window of the guest room, her thoughts tangled in the stories of shadows, gates, and lost offerings. She had always known there was something hidden in Takaira, some deep, unresolved secret. But now that she knew the truth, it felt like the town itself was suffocating her. The air was thick with something ancient, something malignant, that had never truly gone away. She turned over to glance at Diego, who had fallen asleep on the small cot beside the bed. His breathing was slow and steady, but even in his sleep, she could sense his tension. He, too, had absorbed the gravity of her mother's words. He had been the one to help her confront this horror, and now it felt as though they were trapped within it. There was no escape. The darkness outside was suffused with a strange energy, as if the night itself had become a living, breathing entity watching them. Adriana shuddered and pulled the blankets tighter around her. She had to do something. She couldn't stay here any longer. The shadows, the gate, her mother's warnings. Everything was spiraling out of control. As dawn approached, a faint light began to creep over the horizon, casting a dull glow over the sleepy town. Adriana knew that time was running out. If the offering was to be returned, they needed to act quickly, before the shadows became too powerful to confront. But where would they even begin? The offering had been lost long ago, and her mother's vague descriptions were all they had to go on. The town's history was obscured by years of silence, the records long forgotten. Diego stirred in his sleep, sensing the change in the air. He blinked groggily and looked over at Adriana, his face drawn with exhaustion. "We have to find it, don't we?" he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. Adriana nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in. "We don't have a choice. If we don't, the shadows will consume everything." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the quiet tension between them palpable. It was a decision they had already made, but it felt as though it had just become real. There was no turning back. By the time they made their way to the town center, the sun had risen fully, casting a cold light over the abandoned streets. The town seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but Adriana could feel the undercurrent of something darker, something that had always lurked beneath the surface. The buildings were old and weathered, and the streets were lined with small shops that had long since closed. The town's charm was a facade, masking the decay that had begun to set in years ago. Diego led the way to the small church at the heart of the town, the one place where they might find some answers. It was a place of refuge for the townspeople, a symbol of stability in a town that had slowly crumbled under the weight of its own secrets. Adriana had grown up attending Mass here, though she had never fully understood the significance of the church in the town's history. But now, as she stood before its weathered doors, she realized that this was where the answers would lie. The heavy wooden doors creaked open with a groan as they entered. Inside, the church was dark, save for the shafts of light that pierced through the stained glass windows. The silence was oppressive, and the air felt thick with the weight of centuries of unspoken history. There, in the center of the room, was the altar, simple yet imposing, standing as a reminder of the town's past. Adriana couldn't shake the feeling that the church itself was watching them, its presence an ominous reminder of the force they were about to confront. As they approached the altar, a figure appeared from the shadows, Father Miguel, the town's elderly priest. His thin, lined face was weathered by years of service, and his eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed to surpass his years. He had always been a quiet man, never one to engage in the gossip that permeated the town, but Adriana had always felt an uneasy respect for him. Now, seeing him again in the dim light of the church, she realized he might know more than he had ever let on. "I knew you'd come," he said softly, his voice raspy but calm. "You've awakened the past, haven't you?" Adriana and Diego exchanged a glance. "You know what we're looking for, don't you?" Diego asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Father Miguel nodded slowly. "I know more than you realize. The offering, the gate, the shadows, they are all connected to this town. I've kept the truth hidden for as long as I could, but now it's time for you to learn what really happened." Adriana felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What happened? What did we awaken?" The priest's gaze turned sorrowful, and he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Many years ago, the town was thriving, but with prosperity came greed, and with greed came a decision, a dangerous one. An ancient artifact was discovered, something that could change the very fabric of reality. It was said to be the key to controlling time itself. The town's leaders believed they could use it to shape their own future, to bend fate to their will. Adriana's mind reeled. But it was stolen, wasn't it? That's what caused all this. Father Miguel nodded. Yes, the artifact was taken, hidden away in the hopes that its power would never be used. But by then, the damage had already been done. The shadows were unleashed, and the gate, once sealed, was opened. Adriana's heart skipped a beat. What gate? Where is it? The priest's eyes darkened. The gate is a doorway to another world, one that exists parallel to our own. It's a place of darkness, of lost souls. The offering was the only thing that could keep it sealed, but now it's gone, and the door is slowly opening once more. Diego stepped forward, his voice low with urgency. So how do we stop it? Father Miguel's expression grew grave. There is no simple solution. The offering must be returned to its rightful place, but it will come at a cost. The shadows will not relent. They will fight back with everything they have. Adriana felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The task ahead of them was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But the truth was clear now. There was no escape. The shadows were returning, and the only way to stop them was to face the darkness head-on. The realization that the shadows could no longer be avoided left Adriana in a constant state of tension. The weight of Father Miguel's words hung over her like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. She stood in the church, the air heavy with the knowledge of what had to be done, but not knowing how to begin. The priest had spoken of the gate, an otherworldly entrance hidden beneath the earth. But where could they even start looking for it? The very concept of a parallel world, a place of darkness and lost souls, felt incomprehensible. Diego, standing beside her, shared her anxiety. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a palpable unease. The once peaceful town of Takira, with its quiet streets and small-town charm, had now transformed into something unrecognizable. It was as though every corner, every shadow, was hiding something sinister. And even though they hadn't yet fully grasped the scope of the situation, they knew they were rapidly approaching the point of no return. They left the church, stepping back into the blinding sunlight of the town. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. As they walked through the town square, Adriana could feel eyes on them. Silent, watchful eyes, hidden behind windows and doors. She turned to Diego, searching his face for reassurance, but found none. They were both in over their heads. "We need to speak to more people," Diego suggested, breaking the silence. His voice was low but resolute. "We can't rely solely on the priest's knowledge. There are people here who have lived through all this. They might know something that could help." Adriana nodded, but she didn't feel convinced. The town, it seemed, had been hiding more than just its secrets from outsiders. It had buried them deep within. It was as if the people of Takira had known, all along, that something dark was looming and had learned to live in the shadow of it. They started with the town's oldest residents, the ones who remembered the years before the silence. The elderly woman at the cafe, the old man who ran the corner store. None of them seemed eager to speak. Each conversation was met with cryptic responses, half-hearted denials, and hurried exits. It became clear to Adriana that there was a fear in the air, a fear of stirring up old memories best left forgotten. Even the children of the town, once vibrant and full of life, now carried an air of unease. They looked at Adriana and Diego with wide eyes, as if they could sense the impending storm. But then, after hours of fruitless attempts, they met an old man named Manuel, a former miner who had lived in Takira all his life. His hands were rough, worn from years of labor, and his eyes, though tired, held a gleam of wisdom. He was different from the others. They could see it immediately. He wasn't afraid. He had seen the darkness, and perhaps more importantly, he had survived it. Adriana approached him cautiously, feeling the weight of the years between them. "Do you know anything about the gate?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with desperation. Manuel's gaze softened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He simply looked at the two of them as if sizing them up, weighing whether they were truly ready to hear the truth. Finally, he spoke in a gravelly voice, barely above a whisper. "The gate is not something you can just find. It's hidden beneath the earth, buried in the tunnels that run deep under this town. But not everyone can see it. The gate reveals itself only to those who are meant to find it, and only at the right time." Adriana's heart skipped a beat. "And what happens when it's found?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. Manuel's face grew darker. "When the gate is opened, it doesn't just let in the shadows. It lets in everything, the forgotten, the lost, and the things that should never have been remembered. The offering you seek, it must be returned before the gate can be sealed again. But be warned, there are those who will stop at nothing to keep it open." Diego clenched his fists, his frustration rising. Who are these people? Why do they want the gate open? Manuel's expression hardened, and his voice dropped to a near inaudible murmur. "Some believe the gate holds the key to eternal life. Others believe that it holds the power to change the past. People have been drawn to its promise for generations. And once it's opened, once the shadows are unleashed, it's impossible to close without a price." Adriana felt a chill run through her. The price. It was a concept she had heard before, but now it felt more real, more imminent. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Manuel leaned in closer, his face a mask of sorrow. "You must descend into the tunnels. Find the gate. Return the offering. And be prepared to make a sacrifice." The weight of his words pressed down on Adriana's chest. A sacrifice? What could that mean? And what was this offering they had to return? Was it a physical object? Or was it something more abstract, something tied to the town's past? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and increasingly urgent. "Thank you," she said softly, turning away from Manuel. Diego followed her lead, but as they walked back toward the edge of town, the air felt heavier, the tension building like the quiet before a storm. Every step felt like a step closer to something they were not ready to face, but that they had no choice but to confront. As night fell, the town of Takira seemed to hold its breath. Adriana and Diego stood at the edge of the mountains, looking toward the darkened valley where the mines once lay. The wind howled in the distance, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. The entrance to the tunnels, the gate, the shadows, all of it was down there, hidden beneath layers of dirt and time. The town, it seemed, had been built on top of something far older and more dangerous than anyone could have known. The time had come. They would descend into the earth, into the darkness, and face whatever awaited them below. But Adriana knew, deep in her bones, that the secrets of Takira would not be easily uncovered. And once they entered the tunnels, there would be no going back. The night that Adriana and Diego prepared to descend into the tunnels was one shrouded in uneasy silence. The stars above the mountains had vanished behind a blanket of clouds, leaving the landscape in near total darkness. The only sounds were the distant rustling of trees in the wind and the occasional crackling of the dry earth beneath their feet. It was as though the town itself had gone into hiding, retreating into the shadows to avoid the confrontation that was soon to unfold. The old man, Manuel, had given them a map, a crude, hand-drawn thing that seemed to offer no more than vague directions and an unsettling sense of finality. The entrance to the tunnels, marked with a simple X on the map, was hidden somewhere in the valley, near the remnants of an old mine. As they stood at the edge of the town, staring into the abyss of the night, Adriana couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The town's eyes seemed to follow them, invisible and omnipresent. But there was no turning back now. "I don't like this," Diego muttered, his voice thick with tension. "What if the shadows have already escaped? What if it's too late?" Adriana didn't answer him right away. Her mind was consumed by the same thoughts, but she couldn't afford to dwell on fear. She had to keep moving forward, if not for herself, then for the people of Takira. She had seen the way the town had changed, how the once vibrant streets had grown quieter, how the laughter of children had turned into something hollow. The gate, whatever it was, had to be sealed before the shadows consumed everything. "We don't have a choice," she finally said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her insides. "We have to find it. We have to stop whatever's been unleashed." With the map in hand, they began their descent into the valley. The terrain was rocky, uneven, and treacherous. The air grew colder as they moved further from the warmth of the town, and the sense of isolation intensified with each step. Adriana could hear the crunch of their boots on the dry earth, the sound almost deafening in the stillness of the night. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the earth itself was closing in on them. As they reached the foot of the valley, they found the remains of the mine. The entrance was hidden beneath a tangled mess of vines and overgrowth, as though the earth had been trying to swallow it whole. It was a hollowed-out structure, its metal frame rusted and twisted, a silent testament to years of decay. The air around it felt heavier, charged with an ominous energy. Adriana's heart raced as she stepped closer, every instinct warning her to turn back. But she had come this far. There was no retreat now. Diego pushed aside the vines, revealing a narrow opening in the stone. It was barely wide enough for them to pass through, but it was enough. They exchanged a glance, both of them understanding the gravity of what they were about to do. With one final, lingering look at the valley above, they entered the darkness. The tunnels beneath the earth were labyrinthine, winding and narrow, the walls slick with moisture and age. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of dirt and decay. It was as though time had been suspended down here, the very earth itself holding its breath. Adriana could feel the weight of the years pressing in on them, the remnants of something ancient and forgotten. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the sense of isolation became overwhelming. It was as if the world outside no longer existed, There was only the darkness and the unknown. Adriana felt her skin prickle with unease. Every step felt as though they were venturing further into something that was never meant to be disturbed. They walked in silence. The only sounds the echo of their footsteps and the distant drip of water from somewhere deep in the earth. The map they had been given had little more than vague directions, but it was clear that they were heading in the right direction. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air was growing thin. "It's getting colder," Diego remarked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Adriana nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. "We have to keep going. The gate is down here somewhere. We'll find it." The tunnel narrowed even further, forcing them to move single file. It was dark, so dark that Adriana could barely make out the shape of the walls ahead. The flashlight in Diego's hand offered little comfort, its beam barely cutting through the dense blackness. Then, as they rounded a sharp corner, the passage opened up into a cavern. The sight that greeted them took their breath away. The cavern was vast, stretching out in all directions. Its walls were covered in strange markings, symbols, almost like an ancient language etched into the stone. The ground was uneven, dotted with jagged rocks and boulders that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. In the center of the cavern stood a structure, half buried in the earth. It was impossible to tell what it was, some sort of altar or pedestal, its surface slick with dark, viscous liquid. "This is it," Adriana whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of awe and fear. Diego stepped forward, but Adriana held him back. "Wait," she said urgently. "Do you feel that?" It was subtle at first, a slight vibration beneath their feet. But as they stood there, the sensation grew stronger. The cavern seemed to hum with an energy that was both alien and familiar. Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that this wasn't just a place of hiding. It was a place of power. The shadows were not merely hidden here. They were alive, waiting. The realization hit her with a cold clarity. The gate wasn't a physical door. It was something far more dangerous, a force that had been buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, and it was awakening. Adriana and Diego shared a glance, both understanding the magnitude of what they were about to face. The gate, the shadows, the offering, it all came down to this moment. And they weren't ready, but they had no choice. In the dim light of the cavern, the presence of the altar, or whatever it was, seemed to mock their presence. It pulsed with a subtle rhythm, an ancient energy emanating from its core. Adriana could feel the weight of something beyond their comprehension pressing down upon them, a force so old and dark that it threatened to break the very fabric of reality. The vibrations in the ground had become stronger, their rhythm more pronounced, as though the earth itself was awakening to something they had yet to fully understand. "What is that thing?" Diego's voice trembled, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a heavy shroud. His words seemed insignificant in the vastness of the cavern, swallowed up by the eerie silence that enveloped them. Adriana didn't respond at first. She couldn't. Her gaze remained fixed on the altar, which seemed to call to her, an invisible tether pulling her toward it despite the instincts that screamed for her to run. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Every part of her mind told her this was wrong, dangerous even, but something deeper, more primal, seemed to compel her forward. She had come this far. She had to see it through, no matter the cost. But as she stepped closer, a low, guttural sound reverberated from deep within the stone. It was unlike any sound she had heard before, part growl, part hum, and filled with a sense of malice that made her skin crawl. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The noise intensified, echoing through the cavern, until it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just coming from the altar, it was coming from all around them, vibrating through the very walls themselves. Adriana, Diego's voice was barely audible, and she could hear the terror in it. He had felt it too. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. The cavern seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was alive and angry at their intrusion. Rocks shifted and fell, and dust poured down from above, choking the air. Adriana reached out instinctively, grabbing Diego's arm, pulling him closer as if that would somehow shield them from whatever was about to happen. The altar before them began to glow, dimly at first, a sickly green light that grew in intensity until it bathed the entire cavern in its unnatural hue. Adriana's pulse quickened. She tried to back away, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself had turned against them. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, each step more difficult than the last. The glow from the altar intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, as if to respond to their presence, the air seemed to warp. The very fabric of reality seemed to stretch, and Adriana felt a cold, suffocating pressure close in on her chest. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls of the cavern were closing in. The oppressive energy was suffocating, almost tangible. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as if the atmosphere itself had turned against her. And then, in a sudden and jarring shift, the noise stopped. Adriana blinked, her head spinning, trying to process what had just happened. She could still feel the presence in the air, but the deafening hum had ceased. The cavern was silent again, save for the distant drip of water echoing in the dark. The glow from the altar remained, but it no longer felt as oppressive. It was as if something had shifted, something had passed. But what? Did you see that? Diego asked, his voice hoarse with fear. Adriana nodded, though she couldn't quite explain what had just transpired. Something had happened in that moment, a shift, a moment of connection, perhaps, but the world around them had changed. It was as if they had crossed a threshold into something far darker than they could have imagined. They hadn't just disturbed a hidden relic, they had disturbed something alive. Without a word, Adriana took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. There was a sense of finality in the air, a feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. She could sense that whatever lay at the heart of this place was watching them now, aware of their presence in a way that transcended logic. Adriana, we need to leave, Diego urged, his voice strained. He was no longer speaking with the usual urgency of someone who sought to escape danger. His voice had a tremor now, filled with uncertainty. Whatever this is, whatever we've found, it's not just a relic. It's something else. She ignored him, her eyes fixed on the altar. She had to know. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. A soft whisper of movement caught her attention, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the air. It was as if something was emerging from the altar, something ancient and terrible, writhing beneath the surface. Adriana's heart raced as she realized that they weren't alone in the cavern anymore. The shadows in the room had begun to take shape, twisting and contorting, moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. And then, she saw it. Something slithering from the altar, a figure formed from the very darkness itself, its shape fluid and ever-changing. It was like a shadow, but not a living, breathing entity made of pure darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two glowing orbs that flickered with an otherworldly malice. It moved toward her, its presence suffocating, and she could feel its hatred radiating from it like a physical force. "Run!" Diego shouted, finally grabbing her arm and pulling her back. But Adriana couldn't move. She was paralyzed, her gaze locked on the creature before her, its form now becoming more solid, more real. The shadows that had once been confined to the edges of the room were now alive, reaching out toward them with claw-like tendrils. It was too late. The shadows had already been released, and the gate, the thing they had come to seal, was no longer a relic. It was a living, breathing nightmare, hungry for their souls. In the dim light of the cavern, the presence of the altar, or whatever it was, seemed to mock their presence. It pulsed with a subtle rhythm, an ancient energy emanating from its core. Adriana could feel the weight of something beyond their comprehension pressing down upon them, a force so old and dark that it threatened to break the very fabric of reality. The vibrations in the ground had become stronger, their rhythm more pronounced, as though the earth itself was awakening to something they had yet to fully understand. "What is that thing?" Diego's voice trembled, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a heavy shroud. His words seemed insignificant in the vastness of the cavern, swallowed up by the eerie silence that enveloped them. Adriana didn't respond at first. She couldn't. Her gaze remained fixed on the altar, which seemed to call to her, an invisible tether pulling her toward it despite the instincts that screamed for her to run. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Every part of her mind told her this was wrong, dangerous even, but something deeper, more primal, seemed to compel her forward. She had come this far. She had to see it through, no matter the cost. But as she stepped closer, a low, guttural sound reverberated from deep within the stone. It was unlike any sound she had heard before, part growl, part hum, and filled with a sense of malice that made her skin crawl. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The noise intensified, echoing through the cavern, until it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just coming from the altar, it was coming from all around them, vibrating through the very walls themselves. Adriana, Diego's voice was barely audible, and she could hear the terror in it. He had felt it too. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. The cavern seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was alive and angry at their intrusion. Rocks shifted and fell, and dust poured down from above, choking the air. Adriana reached out instinctively, grabbing Diego's arm, pulling him closer, as if that would somehow shield them from whatever was about to happen. The altar before them began to glow, dimly at first, a sickly green light that grew in intensity until it bathed the entire cavern in its unnatural hue. Adriana's pulse quickened. She tried to back away, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself had turned against them. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, each step more difficult than the last. The glow from the altar intensified, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, as if to respond to their presence, the air seemed to warp. The very fabric of reality seemed to stretch, and Adriana felt a cold, suffocating pressure close in on her chest. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls of the cavern were closing in. The oppressive energy was suffocating, almost tangible. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as if the atmosphere itself had turned against her. And then, in a sudden and jarring shift, the noise stopped. Adriana blinked, her head spinning, trying to process what had just happened. She could still feel the presence in the air, but the deafening hum had ceased. The cavern was silent again, save for the distant drip of water echoing in the dark. The glow from the altar remained, but it no longer felt as oppressive. It was as if something had shifted, something had passed. But what? Did you see that? Diego asked, his voice hoarse with fear. Adriana nodded, though she couldn't quite explain what had just transpired. Something had happened in that moment, a shift, a moment of connection, perhaps, but the world around them had changed. It was as if they had crossed a threshold into something far darker than they could have imagined. They hadn't just disturbed a hidden relic, they had disturbed something alive. Without a word, Adriana took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. There was a sense of finality in the air, a feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. She could sense that whatever lay at the heart of this place was watching them now, aware of their presence in a way that transcended logic. Adriana, we need to leave, Diego urged, his voice strained. He was no longer speaking with the usual urgency of someone who sought to escape danger. His voice had a tremor now, filled with uncertainty. Whatever this is, whatever we've found, it's not just a relic. It's something else. She ignored him, her eyes fixed on the altar. She had to know. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. A soft whisper of movement caught her attention, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the air. It was as if something was emerging from the altar, something ancient and terrible, writhing beneath the surface. Adriana's heart raced as she realized that they weren't alone in the cavern anymore. The shadows in the room had begun to take shape, twisting and contorting, moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. And then, she saw it. Something slithering from the altar, a figure formed from the very darkness itself, its shape fluid and ever-changing. It was like a shadow, but not a living, breathing entity made of pure darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two glowing orbs that flickered with an otherworldly malice. It moved toward her, its presence suffocating, and she could feel its hatred radiating from it like a physical force. "Run!" Diego shouted, finally grabbing her arm and pulling her back. But Adriana couldn't move. She was paralyzed, her gaze locked on the creature before her, its form now becoming more solid, more real. The shadows that had once been confined to the edges of the room were now alive, reaching out toward them with claw-like tendrils. It was too late. The shadows had already been released, and the gate, the thing they had come to seal, was no longer a relic. It was a living, breathing nightmare, hungry for their souls. The weight of Adriana's decision to approach the altar, to disturb whatever ancient force lay dormant, pressed heavily on her chest. Even as she tried to pull away from the tendrils of darkness, now creeping across the cavern floor, she could feel the consequences of her actions swirling around her. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, to escape this nightmare before it consumed them both. But fear had already lodged itself deep in her heart, not just for herself, but for what lay beyond this place. She had glimpsed a truth too horrific to ignore. Something had awoken in these depths, and the world outside was in danger of being consumed by it. The creature's form was no longer a mere shadow, but a mass of writhing darkness with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. It floated just above the ground, its tendrils reaching out with a hunger that was palpable. They extended and retracted like serpents, testing the air for the scent of prey. The cavern had become a tomb, its stone walls reverberating with the faintest hum, as if the air itself was mourning their intrusion. Adriana could sense that they had crossed a line that should have never been crossed, and the consequences of that action would not be easily undone. Diego had been pulled out of his own paralyzed fear, now desperately trying to drag Adriana away. "Adriana, please, we need to get out." His voice cracked as he yanked at her arm. But Adriana couldn't tear her gaze away from the horror unfolding before them. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to undo what they had done. The creature's eyes flickered toward Diego, as if it had acknowledged him for the first time. In a flash of motion that was too fast for her to comprehend, one of the tendrils shot forward, wrapping around his legs. He screamed, the sound echoing throughout the cavern as he was lifted off the ground, his body jerking helplessly in the grip of the dark entity. Adriana's heart leapt in her throat, her breath catching in her chest. "Diego!" she cried, her voice a mix of panic and desperation. She reached for him, her fingers grazing his before the tendrils pulled him further away, dragging him toward the altar. His eyes locked with hers, wide with terror, as he was pulled toward the creature that now regarded him with a chilling, unfeeling stare. Adriana's feet moved before she could think, propelled by a surge of adrenaline. She couldn't let this happen, not after everything they had endured. She couldn't lose him now, not when they were so close to understanding what lay beneath the surface. She grabbed a nearby stone, hefting it in her hands before hurling it toward the creature. The stone collided with one of its tendrils, causing a deafening crack to fill the air. But it was not enough to stop the creature. The darkness seemed to absorb the force of the impact, as if it were nothing more than a fleeting annoyance. The creature let out a low, guttural noise, and for a moment, everything went still. The tendrils released Diego, who fell to the ground, gasping for air. But before either of them could react, the cavern began to tremble once more. The altar pulsed with an unnatural glow, and the very walls of the cavern seemed to bend and warp around them. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and Adriana could feel a cold wind sweeping through the chamber, carrying with it the scent of decay and ruin. Diego staggered to his feet, his eyes wide with fear as he looked around. This isn't just a place," he whispered, more to himself than to Adriana. "This is a gateway, a rift to something beyond." Adriana nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known that they weren't just dealing with an ancient relic, but she hadn't expected this. What lay in these depths wasn't just a dark force. It was a passage to something far older, something that had once been imprisoned beneath the earth. They had opened the door, And now, the consequences were unfolding before them. As the air grew colder, the shadows in the cavern seemed to coalesce into something far more tangible. They were no longer mere tendrils. They were a living, breathing entity capable of thought, capable of purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it was now centered on them. The creature's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Adriana felt a voice echo in her mind. A voice that was not her own, yet not entirely alien either. The blood of the forgotten will feed the gate. Adriana froze, her mind reeling from the words that reverberated through her skull. She glanced at Diego, his face pale with fear. The realization hit them both at once. The creature wasn't after them for the sake of destruction alone. It needed something from them, something crucial to its existence. It was not merely a guardian of this place. It was the keeper of the rift, and it demanded a price for its continued existence. What does it want? Diego gasped, his voice strained with panic. What is this thing? Adriana's gaze shifted back to the altar, now bathed in the sickly green light. The pulsating glow seemed to beckon them, promising knowledge, but at a terrible cost. She had already made the mistake of disturbing the peace of this place. But there was still a chance, just one slim chance, that she could understand what had happened here, that she could stop whatever this creature had begun. We need to close it, Adriana muttered under her breath, more to herself than to Diego. She had to figure out how to undo their mistake before it was too late. But the entity seemed to hear her, its tendrils rising again as it stretched toward her. It had been patient, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Its voice, now clear in her mind, seeped into her thoughts like poison. The blood of the forgotten is the price you must pay to close the gate. Adriana's body froze as she pieced together the grim reality of their situation. The forgotten were those who had perished in this place, the ones who had once been drawn to the power that lay hidden here. And now, it seemed, their blood was required to seal the rift. The question was not if they would be consumed, but when. The creature moved closer, and the cavern's oppressive weight seemed to press in on them. Adriana had no answers, only the looming sense that they were caught in a game much larger than themselves, a game that had begun long before they ever set foot in this cursed place. The cold wind continued to howl through the cavern, carrying with it an unnatural chill that seemed to pierce through the very marrow of Adriana's bones. Her heart raced, and her breath came in ragged gasps as the creature's presence became more oppressive, more insistent. The ground beneath her feet trembled with the weight of the ancient power stirring in the depths of the cavern. Every step she took, every movement she made, seemed to draw her closer to the altar, the very epicenter of this catastrophe. She could feel the eyes of the creature upon her, watching, waiting for her next move. Diego had backed away, his face pale with fear, his hands trembling as he tried to process the situation. But there was no time for indecision. Adriana knew that they had no choice but to act. Somehow, they needed to stop this madness, close the rift, and prevent the creature from unleashing whatever horror it had been guarding for centuries. But the realization was becoming clear. The cost of stopping the creature was not something they could escape. It had already been made known to them, the blood of the forgotten, a price that could not be paid with mere action alone. The very essence of their existence, it seemed, had become entangled in the web of this cursed place. The creature's tendrils, coiling in the air like serpents, seemed to pulse with anticipation. Its eyes were now focused on Adriana with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear straight to her core. It knew she was the key, the one who had awakened it, the one who had dared to disturb the delicate balance of the forces at play here. The rift had been waiting for someone like her, someone willing to confront the ancient power locked away for so long. But the creature's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the price that awaited them. The blood of the forgotten will seal the gate. But it is not your blood alone that must be offered. Adriana swallowed hard, the words reverberating through her skull. She could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on her like an insurmountable weight. The creature was not interested in just any sacrifice. It wanted more. It wanted the blood of those who had entered this cursed place, those who had uncovered its secrets. It wanted them to become a part of its dark ritual. Her mind raced as she tried to formulate a plan, but the truth was inescapable. The creature would not stop until it had claimed its price, until it had drawn them into the rift and made them a part of its dark history. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. They could not escape. There was no running from this, no way to undo what had been done. The rift, the creature, the price. It had all been set in motion the moment they had entered this place. Diego, ever the pragmatic one, seemed to come to the same conclusion, his face etched with resignation. "We can't fight it, can we?" he asked, his voice low and strained. His words were not so much a question as an acknowledgement of the inevitable. Adriana shook her head, her thoughts a whirlpool of confusion and dread. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't." She had known, deep down, that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But hearing the words spoken aloud made the truth all the more real. They had to give something in return, something of themselves. The creature, sensing their despair, seemed to grow more impatient. Its tendrils lashed out, circling around them like a noose tightening with every passing second. Adriana could feel the cold, wet grip of the tendrils as they brushed against her skin, but she refused to flinch. She refused to let it take control of her mind completely. "We have to find a way out of this," she muttered, more to herself than to Diego. "There has to be a way." But deep down, she knew there was no escaping what had been set into motion. They were bound to the creature's will, just as the Forgotten had been bound to it centuries ago. The only question now was how much they were willing to sacrifice to stop it. A terrible realization swept over Adriana as she looked at Diego. He seemed so small, so fragile in the face of this ancient, all-consuming power. And yet, despite the fear and the overwhelming odds, he was still standing beside her. She could see the same determination in his eyes that had been there when they first ventured into the jungle, when they had sought to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the earth. They had always believed they could control their fate, that they could outsmart whatever challenges they faced. But this was something different. It was a force beyond their understanding, beyond their control. The creature's voice rippled through her mind once more, a low, menacing whisper. "You cannot escape the cost of knowledge. You cannot escape the price of the Forgotten." Adriana closed her eyes, her mind spinning with the weight of the creature's words. It was right. They could not escape. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn the price against it. The blood it demanded didn't have to come from them. Perhaps there was another way to close the rift, to stop the creature from consuming the world with its dark power. Diego's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and clear. "Adriana, we have to make a choice. Now, before it's too late." She turned to him, her heart heavy with the burden of the decision they faced. There was no going back. Whatever they chose, the consequences would be dire. But in that moment, Adriana realized something crucial. Sometimes, the greatest sacrifice is not the one made for survival, but the one made for something greater than oneself. "It's time." The creature's voice echoed in her mind once more. "The gate is ready to open. The blood of the Forgotten will seal it, or it will consume you." With no other options before them, Adriana took a deep breath. She knew that the time for escape had passed. The time for sacrifice had arrived. As the darkness thickened around them, Adriana could feel the weight of the creature's anticipation growing with every passing second. The air in the cavern became dense, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere itself was pushing down on them, squeezing the life out of their lungs. Every breath she took felt heavier than the last, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the cavern were closing in on them. It was as if the ancient force, the creature that had been waiting for centuries, was finally waking up, fully aware of the power it now possessed. The altar ahead of them seemed to pulse with an energy that was both alien and familiar. Adriana had seen it before in her dreams, in the visions that had come to her ever since they entered this cursed place. But now, the altar seemed to have a life of its own, a beating heart beneath the stone. It was as if the cavern itself had come alive, responding to the creature's presence, to the very opening of the rift. Adriana could hear Diego's breath quickening beside her, and she turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was no need for words. They both understood the gravity of their situation. There was no way out now. The creature had them trapped, and there was no escape from the price it demanded. But Adriana still couldn't bring herself to give up entirely. The thought of the rift swallowing everything, the idea of the world descending into chaos under the creature's influence, was a fate worse than death itself. "We have to stop it," she said, her voice hoarse with fear, determination, and something else, something that bordered on desperation. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "There has to be another way. There has to be something we can do." Diego didn't respond immediately, but his eyes flickered toward the altar, then back to Adriana. She could see the conflict within him, the same internal struggle she herself was facing. There was no escape from the creature's power, but was there a way to stop it without making the ultimate sacrifice? Was there a way to sever the connection between the creature and the rift without unleashing something far worse upon the world? The creature's presence loomed over them, its power radiating through the cavern, and Adriana felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss. The creature's whispers curled around her mind, like tendrils reaching into her thoughts. "You cannot escape what you have awakened. The rift demands its price, and only blood can seal the gate." Adriana's heart thudded painfully in her chest. It was too late for them to turn back, too late to undo the mistakes they had made. They had opened the rift, and now the consequences were inevitable. The creature was right about one thing. They had awakened something ancient, something powerful, and it would not be silenced or denied. There was no going back. And yet, as she stared at the altar, a flicker of hope sparked within her. The creature had been clear. The rift needed blood, the blood of the forgotten. But what if the sacrifice didn't have to be hers or Diego's? What if there was a way to turn the creature's demands back upon itself, to trap it in the very rift it sought to unleash? "Diego," Adriana said, her voice gaining strength, "I think I've found a way. I think we can use the rift against it." Diego looked at her, his expression wary but hopeful. "How? How can we possibly turn this around?" Adriana's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the strange symbols and visions that had haunted her for so long. The rift was not just a gateway, it was a conduit for ancient energy, for power beyond human comprehension. But the creature had been feeding on that energy for centuries, binding itself to the rift. It wasn't just a creature of flesh and blood. It was a manifestation of the rift itself. The key to stopping it, to sealing the gate once and for all, was not to offer more blood, but to sever the creature's connection to the rift entirely. The rift itself was the source of its power, and the only way to destroy the creature was to destroy the rift. And the only way to destroy the rift was to use its power against it. Adriana's gaze shifted to the altar once more, and she saw the faintest flicker of movement beneath the stone. The creature was stirring, preparing to claim its sacrifice. But if she was right, if she could manipulate the energy in the rift, she might just have enough power to shut it down. "We need to close the rift," Adriana said, her voice steady now, filled with resolve. "But we can't do it from here. We need to get closer to the altar, to the source of the rift. That's where the real power is." Diego nodded, though his face was still filled with uncertainty. "And how do you plan to do that? It's not like we have any weapons, or—" "We don't need weapons," Adriana interrupted, her eyes locked on the altar. "We need to use the creature's own power against it. We need to feed it back into the rift." Diego seemed to hesitate for a moment, then nodded again. "All right, let's do it. But we have to hurry." Adriana felt a surge of determination as they moved toward the altar. The creature was watching them, its gaze burning through them like fire, but it could not stop them. Not yet. The rift, the creature, the power, everything was coming to a head now. Everything they had done had led them to this moment. The final act was about to begin, and there was no turning back. As they approached the altar, the ground shook violently beneath their feet. The cavern trembled, the walls cracking and groaning in protest. It was as though the very earth itself was rejecting their intrusion, unwilling to let them tamper with the forces they had awakened. But Adriana didn't falter. She couldn't afford to. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The creature had underestimated them. It had underestimated her. She would not allow it to win. She would not allow the rift to open. With a final, defiant breath, Adriana stepped forward, her hand reaching for the heart of the altar. The air around her grew thick with energy, crackling with the raw, untamed power of the rift. And then, with a single motion, she thrust her hand into the stone. The world erupted in a blaze of light. The explosion of light was blinding. Adriana's body jerked forward, her arms still locked within the altar's stone surface, but the power coursing through her felt like it was about to tear her apart. She could hear nothing. No sounds, no voices, no breath. Everything around her had gone silent, the world falling away as if time itself had ceased to exist. The energy she had unleashed surged through her, and in that instant, it felt as though she had become one with the rift itself. She felt her pulse racing, the rhythm of her heart syncing with the chaotic energy that swirled around her. It was as if she were being torn into 1,000 pieces, but at the same time, it felt like she was being pulled into something greater. The rift had recognized her touch. The creature had realized her intent, and in that realization, the creature screamed, a high-pitched, guttural wail that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of reality itself. Adriana's mind was reeling. She could see flashes, snippets of visions, images of the creature, images of the world beyond the rift, images of destruction, of chaos, of things beyond comprehension. And yet, within that maelstrom of images, there was a single thought that cut through the noise. It's too late. She had been so focused on stopping the creature, so focused on destroying the rift, that she had failed to realize the one thing that could not be undone. The creature was bound to the rift. It was a part of it, as much a part of the fabric of the world as the air she breathed. By attempting to sever the rift's power, she had unwittingly bound herself to the creature, her very essence now intertwined with its existence. She had thought that the rift's power could be controlled, that it could be contained, but she had underestimated its depth, its pull. Adriana staggered backward, pulling her arm from the altar with a gasp. The vision before her flickered and shifted, the world around her warping as though she were watching through a cracked mirror. The cavern trembled once more, and the walls began to groan, their surfaces cracking open like the skin of a dying beast. "What have we done?" Diego's voice was hoarse, distant, as if he too were being pulled into the same nightmare that Adriana was experiencing. She turned to him, but he looked different. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at something else, something that had come from the rift. The creature had emerged, not fully, but enough to be seen. Its form was indistinct, a swirling mass of darkness and light, something both alien and familiar. It hovered just beyond the altar, its shape shifting like smoke, as though it were trying to find a way to anchor itself in the physical world. Its presence was suffocating, oppressive, its very being pressing down on everything around them. Adriana's mind was spinning. The creature was no longer just a presence in the rift. It was here, in the world, and she had unknowingly opened the floodgates. The rift had demanded blood, but it was the price of the living that had been paid. She was now a vessel for the creature, a conduit through which its power flowed into the world. And in that moment, Adriana understood. The rift could not simply be closed. It could not be sealed, not without one final sacrifice. Her sacrifice. The creature's voice, though not heard in words, whispered in her mind once more, the price has been paid. Only one can leave this place. One must remain to close the gate. Diego was still staring at the creature, his hands shaking as he reached out for her, his expression filled with disbelief. "Adriana, what's happening? What did we do?" Adriana shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, that they could still escape, that they could still fix this. But deep down, she knew the truth. The rift was not just a door. It was a prison, and they were both its captives. "I'm sorry, Diego," she whispered, her voice cracking. "There's no way out. Not for me. Not for you." She could feel the pull of the creature, its power calling to her, urging her to surrender, to let go. It was as though it had known all along that this moment would come, that she would be the one to open the door. She had been its chosen vessel from the start. Adriana reached for Diego's hand, her fingers trembling. For a brief, fleeting moment, she wished that they could have had more time. She wished they could have gone back, undo everything they had done. But there was no going back. The rift had opened, and the creature had been unleashed. And now, only one of them could survive. Diego's eyes widened as the realization hit him. No, you can't. You don't have to do this. But Adriana already knew what had to be done. She didn't want to die, but in this moment, she understood that her death was the only way to close the gate, to stop the creature from spreading its influence into the world. The cost was her life, but in her sacrifice, the rift would finally be sealed. Adriana closed her eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. She could feel the creature's power coursing through her, the pull of its darkness, but she resisted. She had one chance, one final act to sever the bond, one final sacrifice to stop the chaos from consuming everything. She turned to face the altar once more, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The world around her had begun to fracture, the walls trembling as the rift threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality. And as she stepped forward, her resolve solidified. She reached out to the altar, and in that final moment, Adriana gave herself to the rift. The creature screamed, and then silence. The world stood still. In the aftermath of Adriana's sacrifice, everything around them fell into a hushed, eerie quiet. The cavern, once trembling and alive with the pulse of the rift, now lay dormant. There was no more shifting of air, no more oppressive weight bearing down on the landscape. For the first time since they had stepped foot into this forsaken place, the silence felt absolute. It was a silence that carried with it the heaviness of 1,000 unspoken words, a stillness that seemed to last forever. Diego stood alone, his heart a maelstrom of emotions that he could no longer comprehend. He had been so sure that they would find a way to make it through together. They had come this far, navigated impossible odds, and yet here they were. He, standing in the ruins of a forgotten world, alone. He could still feel the faintest trace of Adriana's presence, a warmth that had once filled the air around him. But now it was gone. The altar, once a source of immense power, now looked like nothing more than a relic of an ancient past, a symbol of the destruction that had unfolded within its sacred walls. It was no longer a conduit for evil, no longer the engine that had brought forth the monstrous being that had plagued their world. The rift had closed, its edges now sealed, as though it had never existed. But Diego could feel it, deep within his bones. He could still sense the lingering effect of what they had unleashed. The world was safe, but at what cost? He looked down at his hands, still trembling from the ordeal. His mind was flooded with memories of everything that had transpired, the horrors they had encountered, the creature they had fought, the choices that had led them here. But above all, one image burned brighter than the rest. Adriana's face as she had stepped forward, choosing to close the rift, knowing that the only way to end the nightmare was through her own death. Adriana. The name escaped his lips like a prayer, a lament for the woman who had sacrificed everything to save the world. There was nothing left but the echo of her presence, her final act of defiance against the creature that had once sought to tear their world apart. But the price of that victory was something Diego would never be able to forget. He had lost her, and that loss was a wound that would never fully heal. The cavern was still, but there was a sense of something shifting beneath the surface. Diego's eyes moved toward the entrance of the cave, the place where they had first entered. The light from the outside world beckoned him, distant, cold, but promising. He had come this far, and yet now, as he stood in the silence, he couldn't help but feel as though he was standing at the threshold of a new beginning. Had the rift truly been sealed, or was it simply dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken again? Diego didn't know the answer, and perhaps, in some way, he didn't want to know. The creature that had once clawed its way through the rift was gone, but its mark had been left on the world. It was a mark that could never be erased, a scar on the fabric of reality itself. He had seen the horrors that the rift had unleashed, the destruction it had caused, and yet he could not shake the feeling that the rift had been more than just a portal to another world. It had been a reflection of something within humanity itself. The creature had sought to destroy, to corrupt, to consume. And yet, in Adriana's sacrifice, she had chosen the one thing that the creature could never understand: selflessness. The stillness in the air grew heavy once more, and Diego knew that there was only one thing left to do. He had to leave. He had to return to the world beyond the cavern and tell the story, to share the truth of what had happened here, to honor the memory of Adriana and the cost she had paid. But even as he thought this, he knew that there would be no easy return. The world he had left behind had already been changed, irrevocably altered by the events that had unfolded in the darkness of the rift. And the truth he would carry with him was one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He turned toward the entrance of the cave, his footsteps echoing as he made his way through the darkened halls. The world outside awaited him, but there was no escaping the weight of the choices they had made. They had faced the darkness together, but in the end, only one of them had walked away. And yet, as Diego stepped out into the light, he could not shake the feeling that the rift had not been entirely closed. The echoes of the creature's presence, the weight of its hunger, still lingered in the corners of his mind. It was a part of him now, just as it had been a part of Adriana. The world was safe, but for how long? Diego didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain: he would carry Adriana's memory with him forever. And in the end, that would have to be enough.